So before we jump into ZBrush, we're back in Character Creator 3 where we are grabbing our base female and using the ZBrush bridge in Character Creator 3 to send over that Ztool to ZBrush. Working in ZBrush 2021, as you can see. So this is just sort of an experiment that I often utilize, which is the ability to import a pose model on a layer, so long as that geometry does not change. But the great benefit here is I don't have to rely on having that different pose inside of ZBrush, because I can quickly use GoZ to send this model back over to Character Creator 3. This chapter and the following chapter are going to cover the basics of costume and asset creation for character concept. Now we will go through some certain procedures to decimate our models and to lower the resolution, but the caveat here being that these are not game ready assets. These are going to be 3D pieces of geometry that are going to be used purely for form for our concept. But that being said, with the advent of the tools inside of Character Creator 3 in tandem with the tools now at our disposal inside of ZBrush and Photoshop, we can get some really incredible results that will yield us pretty close to photorealistic look at our character concepts. So here I'm just going through a series of extractions using masks off of that original model to generate pants and shirts and vests. So with a character concept like this, it's always about layering these elements, and I'm starting with that internal or the internal elements of the costume here. So just inflating the pants a little bit, I imagine these are going to be almost skin tight leather pants, built more for utilitarian function or athleticism or agility versus comfort here. So this is not necessarily going to be streetwear, even though we're going to try and make it look as cool as possible. The goal here is to serve a function. So now I'm just kind of going in, as you can see, and filling in some of the rear end there, and trying to make it look a little bit more pant-like and less like long johns here. So as you can see, I'm just kind of smoothing out an experiment. I'm just leaving this in because I think it's always fun to see the sort of trial and error aspect to creating. We could edit out all the speed bumps and mistakes, but this was a pretty smooth process. And obviously, as you get more comfortable with the different softwares, you learn to kind of avoid those. But sometimes it's just a matter of experimenting. So here you can see I just filled it in, just kind of smoothing out some of these details, inflating, smoothing, relaxing, using the shift, release, click, smooth option. That some of you might be familiar with inside of ZBrush. So once again, this is not going to be a ZBrush demo per se. We're going to go over a couple of workflows that I think are really handy in working in tandem with Character Creator 3. But as there is that bridge there, the back and forth just becomes a really wonderful, seamless tool that can be utilized with really great efficiency. So as the legs get filled in here, and I'm kind of working on making these look a little bit more pant-like, I've Dynameshed. It is a little tricky working with this Dynamesh at this scale. One thing to be aware of is that when your model, your avatar model, comes in from Character Creator, is very large within the ZBrush world scene. In fact, if you can see it, the ground plane is actually rather small within my scene. So some tools like Dynamesh are going to yield different results depending on the scale of that geometry inside of the ZBrush world. So just one thing to be aware of, but most of the other tools do work really well. If you do find that your brush size isn't large enough, remember to turn off dynamic scale inside of your brush settings there. So here, just kind of rotating around. At this point, very basic, but at least I have a top in these pants. And of course, the wonderful thing is you can grab assets from inside Character Creator and bring them over as well. So it doesn't just have to be costuming built inside of ZBrush. In fact, one element we're not covering inside this demo, but can actually be used to great effect, is taking the avatar from Character Creator and bringing it over directly into, or from ZBrush into Marvelous Designer, to also make pieces of clothing or costume for your character. And then you can also get some really cool drapery on your design before bringing it into Character Creator 3 for some additional physics simulations. So as they're not as say intense in Character Creator 3, but they actually really yield some really cool results that I was kind of experimenting with to see sort of what effect they would give me. Ultimately, with Character Creator 3, the goal is obviously to transition these models and assets that we're creating into a game engine, or to move them over to Unreal or some other platform, maybe like Unity. But here for us, when discussing this project with Reallusion, we talked about the notion of exploring Character Creator 3 as a potential design tool. And this was a really exciting prospect for me, considering I haven't really seen anyone utilizing it in this way. I've seen some artists use this to, some of the internal tools inside of Character Creator 3 to create some really beautiful likenesses and character models. But I wanted to see if this was something I could utilize on a daily basis in tandem with, pieces of software like ZBrush and Photoshop, or potentially Keyshot for rendering, to get quicker results where, things like posing or moving clothing or accessories in tandem with a character were a little bit more challenging. So you'll notice that as I move through this here too, I'm precise enough with the geometry that I get a clean read, but I also want to make sure that it doesn't get too tight or overly resolved. One thing to keep in mind with, with 3D assets for a concept is the reason we're using them is for the form information and obviously a material read. And that's gotten a lot easier with, rendering tools, whether that be, Blender, Octane, Keyshot, which is a personal favorite of mine. They yield quick results and give you a pretty good, clear read of what the material of these objects are. But that's ultimately what it is. So rather than having to paint or draw out the entire model, we're deciding to sculpt it and use computer-generated lighting to give us these forms that we can then work into. So trying to find a balance between a clean read, but also, not giving it, say, the care and attention that an actual character modeler would on assets. So just going through, moving around this design, seeing how this is reading. And the beautiful thing here is, obviously we can create costume elements to fit other avatars inside of Character Creator. But the beautiful thing here is this was created to fit this model. So I'm almost imagining that, with this being an Android, or if this is a particular model that comes off a conveyor belt, there are going to be others like her. With that ability to duplicate the character herself, then maybe their costumes are generated with that same sort of duplication process, but they're all done like a tailored suit, so everything is fit to them, skin tight, and fit like a hand in glove. So here I'm just using a frame mesh technique to give us a little bit of a seam or a stroke around what I imagine is going to be either this hard plastic or shelled, or maybe like a rigid, really tough, rigid, either fabric or leather material for this vest. And you'll notice as well is that I am introducing a little bit of color into my Ztool with poly paint, just to get some breakup even early on. So even though it's not much, there isn't any poly paint information on our character, because we're actually going to utilize a lot of the beautiful textural detail that is inside of Character Creator. So I'm not doing anything on the character herself inside of ZBrush, but there are going to be some details inside of ZBrush that I'm going to want to put into my costumes and other elements of the wardrobe in here. And I'm going to do vertex painting with poly paint And actually, we'll talk about that here within the upcoming chapter. But we'll be exporting some maps to bring back into Character Creator to get some pretty cool results. So as you can see, I'm just slicing through the geometry, trying to get some cut lines on this sort of vaster breastplate that I'm working up here. And what I really like about this workflow is it's a very organic process. So I definitely do not consider myself a modeler by any stretch of the imagination. And ZBrush is definitely a wonderful sculpting tool. And with some of the newer tools inside of ZBrush, it obviously allows you to do some poly modeling. So it is the best of both worlds. And I've found a really nice even middle ground to yield really cool results with having to worry about placing individual vertices and making sure that that's all correct. So it's actually a very fluid process. So just going through here and remeshing, a very powerful tool, ZRemesher, to lower the geometry of this surface. So we're reducing the vertice count while still keeping what you're seeing here are the polygroups on this tool, so that I can use something like a groups polish or some further deformations. So you can see I was getting some weird break up there, some weird pinching, so I'm just unifying some of these polygroups. There are certainly different ways of working, especially with, any sort of what I would consider hard surface elements inside of ZBrush. Some might find this part of the process a bit tedious, I guess I would say. It may be time consuming, and it can be. And as I mentioned before, I don't want it to feel like I'm creating a final concept, but there are things I'm looking for here to make sure that I'm not getting any sort of weird pinching or anything that's going to light weird. And I do feel like when I've got this lower vertice count here, that I can actually work with this pretty well. So you can see that it's been reduced dramatically, and I'll just continue to experiment with this as need be. So after everything has been cleaned up, I have that lower resolution on my model here, and I can actually start to kind of play with these groups in an easier fashion and, use different extrude functions and some different internal functionality inside of ZBrush that'll allow me to move some of these elements around separately. So I'm just using the move tool here to get some broader adjustments and kind of pull that out. And you can see where some of those facets are in the suit. That just came from polish by groups there, which is one benefit to having the separate poly groups. And the slider down there, which you can find in the bottom right hand corner there, is called mask by poly groups, and that can be found under the brush palette. So it's a masking function that allows you to only work within a specific polygroup based on cursor. So wherever I click first, it's going to affect that polygroup. So you can see wherever I kind of move my cursor, that's going to allow me to move those separately until I adjust that slider. And of course, it's a tolerance scale from 0 to 100. So here I'm just kind of group looping, and as I mentioned before, it really is an experimental process, just kind of figuring out what works, what's going to yield the closest result to what I'm see in my head. And obviously the concept that you all saw earlier that was done in 2D out of Photoshop is off on my second monitor here, so I am looking back to that, referencing that original design, because at this stage it is I would say it kind of feels like it is obviously still design, it's still conceptual, but we are looking at those initial sketches because that is what the client saw. That is pretty much what the client approved and expects to see in the end. So I would say that is our rough. That got us to about 60% there. Now it's up to us to really bring it in for a landing or get us that last 40 or 30% in for a finish. So just tightening up some of those details and making sure, of course, if there are going to be any changes to that design, that they only be ones that are in service of, what was the intended challenge in the first place. So, or kind of executing on that initial challenge. So just using some more extrusions, giving the illusion that there's more plating, really selling the utility of this costume. So it's going to look cool, hopefully, but we also want it to feel functional. So it's not just like urban streetwear. It is going to feel kind of slightly militaristic in its execution, even though it's going to be bright and colorful. But I feel like that'll offer a cool juxtaposition against this really gritty environment that she's going to inhabit. So once again, just kind of going through and outlining with this tubing material just to give kind of a seam around the armor. So just finishing up some of this tubing, controlling it a little bit more organically with the move brush, and just getting things into a position where there isn't any sort of crazy overlap or interpenetration. I want to avoid as much of that as possible at this stage, so that there isn't anything conflicting when I send it over to Character Creator. But like I mentioned earlier, the great thing is it's built to our character. So when we send this over, it should really fit her really well. So you can see even here we have kind of the undershirt and the vest on top. So I'm just kind of looking at the way these things are layering. And yeah, I'm really digging where we're at right now. So this is a really fun part. We're going to actually experiment with at the time of recording, which was a brand new feature introduced in ZBrush 2021, which is dynamics, which was really exciting and extremely serendipitous that it came out right at a time where I was working with Reallusion to create this character that I could build a costume for and bring over. So being able to do these simulations before I bring it over into Character Creator and apply some physics to the costume, I don't know, it just couldn't have worked out any better. So I'm not doing anything crazy in this costume because, as I mentioned before, it really is about this more skin tight costume, but we are certainly going to still get some tension folds, as you can see there. Just a really cool way of getting some folds around those kind of coiled elements around the knee, the area of articulation. So yeah, so even though this is an undersuit and some of this is going to be covered, I still want it there. I know there's going to be some plates on top. And I want it to look too baggy, so I'm trying to be as subtle as possible. And two, you're kind of seeing me experiment with this in real time, as it is a relatively new tool, but it really feels like one of those light bulb game changer moments. Of course, you're still an artist in control, so you really want to make sure that this feature is doing what you want, what the intended design is. Just because it seems like there's some physics involved, I still want this to look the way I want it to look. So I'm making sure it doesn't feel overly baggy, that I'm not getting any weird folds that are giving me a weird read. You can see there in the crotch it's getting kind of baggy. And I really do want to give the illusion that even if this is like a soft leather, that I am getting the desired effect. So I'm just going through and adding some seams to it, really trying to play up the fabrication here and just give it some cool forms that I can work with, before I bring it over to Character Creator to see what I can come up with. So here, just some more slicing. Some of this is just, happy accidents, just see what I can come up with. And I want to play around with this internal padding on the inside, whether she hops on a hover bike or something, maybe there's some extra gear, so when she's riding this vehicle, maybe there's some more heat protection on the outside or the inside. Just trying to bring a little extra life into this costume. And even if we don't see that element within this one 2D illustration, it's just stuff that kind of adds visual interest. It just kind of asks us to say, well, what is that? What is that interesting element to her costume that maybe we weren't as familiar with? So here, just kind of just experimenting with some different functions, trying to see how I can kind of polish or get these stroke around these individual patterns, these sort of circular shapes that I'm also going to use just a slight simulation on, just to get a slight inflate around there, kind of an additional padding, something that just helps sell the function there. So to find some additional breakup, or to double check the breakup on the costume, I like to start filling in some early poly paint into the different forms, or maybe the material breakups even within the one Ztool. So there you can see I'm keeping the kind of black leather pants, but dropping in that kind of dark blue padded inserts on the inside of the thigh, and then keeping the sort of rib material around the knees, an even darker value. And then just slipping over to filling out this backpack design, this really sort of modern or futuristic backpack design that was not conceptualized in the sketch from the front view, but something I definitely wanted to include. So whether this is more survival gear or something that has to do with her patrolling the streets of this urban landscape, this cyberpunk landscape, yeah, it's just going to be something that just has a interesting visual read. So at this stage, I'm just trying to make a clean base to work with, which will allow me to make some more organic changes to the surface as we move on. So just kind of beveling in, extruding in, shipping out. So you can see as part of this is just kind of back and forth, moving over and seeing what works best. And yeah, just constantly just kind of shifting through these changes to see ultimately what will give me the look I'm going for. So I'm using some Boolean functions from Sci-Vang. Really great insert brush set. And yeah, just trying to add some of those secondary forms. I mean, the reality here is some of this might not even be visible from the angle I am rendering out. And you do want to be aware of these decisions, especially when it becomes an efficiency thing. But with it being this 3D model, I do like working around my sculpt, because there's something to be said for having those elements in place. So even if my character is standing 3/4 to camera, some of that might peek through. And to me, if I'm working around the thing uniformly and the design goes through, then it's a very easy shift over to the back view to kind of resolve the character in a 360 format. Or even if they don't request a back design, the great thing about working in 3D is that if something gets approved, I have an asset that I can hand off for the rest of production. So I'm just working on an additional shirt. It's going to be asymmetrical because, as remember in the sketch, she has the sort of mechanical arm. So then we're going to just keep it on one side and keep it to elbow length on her left arm there, and just simply extract that geometry, and yeah, just clean it up a little bit, get that lower resolution to work with, and start extruding this out so we can actually work with this and perform a very similar function like we did on the pants, and run it through some dynamics on the sculpt. And after we get a few folds here, just around the arm here, it's still a pretty tight bit of costuming, but we do want to show she kind of pushed that sleeve up, which will give us room for a gauntlet or something else other than the costume on her left arm there. This will pretty much resolve what I'm going to block out during this chapter regarding our ZBrush workflow. So you can see it's still just kind of noodling around a little bit, just finessing it here and there. One thing to keep in mind, that the size of the folds are dependent on the resolution of your sculpt. So the higher the resolution, the finer folds you're going to get to a certain point that it'll allow you to calculate. So right now there isn't a setting for a specific fabric, so you just have to keep in mind kind of what resolution is going to give you the desired fold quality that you want. And with this being kind of a thick, linen, or say like canvas or cotton material, like a thick cotton, we'll have to keep the resolution low to get those larger folds. And here, just kind of applying some cool, nifty alphas that you can do once everything is in place. Some tertiary details that I think will really help it pop. So by allowing some of that red poly paint through, it's whether it's kind of an illusion of it cutting through to undershirt, or actually I switched over there to that gray, so that just building up those levels. So just little things that the eye can catch to give some more visual interest. And two, I really love selling the idea of the functionality of the design here. So little places where she bolted in or maybe strapped that breastplate to that backpack design where it is right now. So this concludes this chapter. We'll jump into the next portion of our ZBrush.